In 1799, Napoleon seized power in France in a coup, and his new regime, called the Consulate, because he was the first consul, a la the Roman Republic, established a new constitution that specifically pointed out its laws did not apply to France's overseas colonies. Napoleon had plans to reconstruct France's empire in North America that it had lost most of during the 7 Years' War, and to do this, he needed tons of money from France's most valuable colony, Saint-Domingue. And the best way to maximize profits? Why, to reintroduce slavery, of course. That's certainly what the former slaves thought was the plan when in 1802, a French expedition commanded by Napoleon's brother-in-law, Charles Victor Emmanuel I have too many names Leclerc, showed up in Saint-Domingue. This started the second phase of the Haitian Revolution, the fight for independence. So Leclerc eventually had Louverture arrested and shipped to France, where he died in prison in 1803, but this itself did not spark an uprising against the French, because Louverture wasn't actually that popular, largely because he wanted most blacks on the island to continue to grow sugar. Instead, the former slaves only started fighting when Leclerc tried to take away their guns, thus beginning a guerrilla war that the French, despite their superior training and weapons, had absolutely no chance of winning. Although the French were exceedingly cruel, executing women as well as men and importing man-eating dogs from Cuba, the Haitians had the best ally of all: disease, specifically in the form of yellow fever, which killed thousands of French soldiers, including Leclerc himself.
The French Revolution, the emergence of the modern state. So, how did this all begin? For hundreds of years prior to the Revolution, French people, like most Europeans, were divided into three social estates: clergy, nobility, and the lowest estate, the commoners, which existed to serve the other estates. Above all was God's gift to mankind, the king. But this hierarchy was being questioned by the Enlightenment, a movement of intellectuals who promoted the use of reason and science. Revolutionary ideas began to spread to the public. So, in the 1780s, when an economically broke and spoiled monarchy tried to increase taxes on the commoners, resentment reached a new level and riots began. On the 14th of July, 1789, revolutionists stormed the Bastille Fortress, a symbol of the royal power. This date is marked as the beginning of the end of the old monarchy, has become France's Independence Day, even though the king was beheaded only in 1793. Shortly after, the French adopted a universal declaration which stated, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights." This was a radical change, even though it left many people out. But the French Revolution was far from a smooth ride. Actually, it was a bloodbath, which led to external and internal wars. The newly introduced guillotine worked overtime, beheading tens of thousands of French during a period known as the Terror. In 1799, the revolution ended when a military commander by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte seized control of the French legislature, eventually declaring himself emperor. Although the revolution began and ended with a monarchy, it had a crucial impact on Europe and world history, and laid the foundation for a modern state governed by the people. Things you gotta know. Let them eat cake. Queen Marie Antoinette's supposed response upon learning that the poor peasants had no bread. The American Revolution was considered a major source of inspiration to the revolutionists in France. The French tricolor was formed during the Revolution. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity associated with it were superimposed many years later.
The 1773 Tea Act offered tax exemptions and rebates for tea coming in from the British East India Company, which allowed them to dump cheap tea on the colonies, which actually lowered the price of tea. So why were the colonists so mad that on December 16, 1773, they dressed up as Indians and dumped enough tea into Boston Harbor to cause the modern equivalent of a $4 million loss? Some colonists were upset that cheap tea would cut into the profits of smugglers and established tea merchants, but most were just angry on principle. To our great national shame, tea was at the time as important a beverage in the colonies as it was to Brits living in Britain, and to allow the British to tax a near universal product set a precedent that Britain could tax whatever they wanted. But the Tea Partiers miscalculated, thinking that the British would back down in response to their protest. Instead, the British responded by passing a series of acts that colonists came to call the Intolerable Acts. The Massachusetts Government Act curtailed self-government there. The Quartering Act forced colonists to house British soldiers in their homes when ordered to. The Quebec Act extended the southern boundary of Quebec and granted religious toleration to Catholics, which was none too popular with the Great Awakening crowd having recently awoken. The colonial response to these acts is really the start of the American Revolution. First, Massachusetts passed a set of resolutions calling for colonists to 1. Disobey the Intolerable Acts, 2. Stop paying taxes, and 3. Prepare for war. And in September 1774, a group of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia, met in Philadelphia to coordinate the resistance of the Intolerable Act. This was the First Continental Congress, which in setting up the Continental Association to police the boycott and encourage domestic manufacturing was the first real colony-wide government in British America. Thanks. As previously noted, the English crown benefited tremendously from the import of consumer goods to the American colonies, and one of the most effective ways American colonists could protest taxation without representation was by boycotting British products. In order to enforce these boycotts, the protesters created committees of correspondence, which spread information about who was and was not observing the boycotts, and these committees also could coerce non-compliers into compliance, which is to say that they were creating and enforcing policy. Kind of like a government does. The Maryland Committee of Correspondence, in fact, was instrumental in setting up the First Continental Congress, which convened to coordinate a response to the fighting that started in 1775. This was back when Congresses did things, by the way. It was awesome. Anyway, the Continental Congress is most famous for drafting and approving the Declaration of Independence. No thought bubble, that's the Will Smith vehicle, Independence Day. I mean the Declaration of Independence, right, that one. It's not your fault, you guys are Canadian, you've never declared independence. Worth noting, by the way, that the Congress edited out more than a quarter of Jefferson's original declaration, and he forever after insisted that they'd, quote, mangled it. Anyway, I would argue the heavy lifting of the American Revolution was already done by the Declaration. In truth, by the time the shooting started, most of the colonists were already self-governing and had developed a sense of themselves as something separate and different from Great Britain, as evidenced by these committees of correspondence, which functioned as shadow governments, eventually reaching out to foreign governments, establishing an espionage network, tarring and feathering loyalists and royal officials, which, by the way, is incredibly painful and dangerous to the victim, and even recruiting physicians to tell American men that drinking British tea would make them weak and effeminate. Morale among Continental soldiers was often pretty low. Rations were poor and soldiers went unpaid. As Joseph Plum Martin, a soldier from Connecticut, wrote, "They felt they were starving in detail for an ungrateful people who did not care what became of us." And many other colonists didn't fight for independence, they fought with the British. Others were pacifists, like the Quakers, who often had their property confiscated when they refused to fight. And in colonial America, of course, losing property also meant losing rights. And for slaves, the so-called fight for freedom was very different than it was for Continental soldiers, because loyalty to Britain in the war could mean freedom. In 1775, British Governor Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation that granted freedom to any slave who deserted his master and fought for the British. Something like 5,000 slaves took him up on the offer. And in addition, many slaves saw the revolution as a chance to escape. Boston King left a cruel master and later wrote, "I determined to go to Charlestown and throw myself into the hands of the English. They received me readily, and I began to feel the happiness of liberty, of which I knew nothing before." 100,000 slaves are estimated to have fled to the British. Now, many slaves were returned to their masters, but more than 15,000 left the US when the British did. And it's worth remembering that the British Empire abolished slavery in all of its territory by 1843, and without a civil war. Thanks.